One of the most intriguing questions surrounding Custer's movements on June 24th is whether he had already resolved to attack the Sioux village at the earliest opportunity, disregarding Terry's orders and any potential reinforcement from Gibbon. If so, when exactly did he arrive at this decision? The historical evidence is fragmentary at best, with only circumstantial clues such as the prolonged for our halt between 1 and 5 p.m. during which Custer remained largely inactive. Despite the constant activity of scouts, this delay seems unusual, given that the trails were becoming fresher by the hour. Even the least experienced soldiers must have known that the Sioux were within a day or two's ride. Was Custer merely waiting for Varnum's return? Why this inexplicable pause, especially since the Indians had likely been tracking the soldiers for some time? For instance, a pair of Cheyenne warriors, Big Crow and Black White Man, had already spotted the soldiers' camp earlier that afternoon. Still, they appeared to do little with this vital information, almost mirroring Custer's own complacency regarding his reconnaissance of Tulk's Valley. It's worth considering that Little Wolf, who was leading a group of Cheyenne from the Red Cloud Agency, didn't arrive at the larger Sioux encampment until after Custer's engagement on June 25th. If any intelligence from Little Wolf's group had reached the Sioux, it was likely too late to change the outcome. The relative inaction on both sides raises many questions. Was Custer's decision to wait part of a larger, more calculated strategy, or was it simply hesitation? A failure to recognize the urgency of the moment. Later that evening, as darkness enveloped the camp, Varholm and his scouts were dispatched to follow the vast trail left by the Sioux. Several scouts returned with reports that the Sioux had shifted westward, crossing the divide to the lower Little Bighorn. Interestingly, at this point, it was still unclear whether the Sioux were heading downstream or not. This confusion was somewhat surprising, given Terry's overall strategy. His plan had been to scout the upper reaches of the Rosebud River, cross to the upper Little Bighorn, and drive the Sioux toward the blocking force Terry would establish on the 26th. However, on the evening of the 24th, Terry was still 30 miles away from his target location. Custer now faced a dilemma. He could continue to follow the Rosebud, risking detection and potentially losing track of the Sioux village, or he could take a more daring approach, cross the divide during the night, and attempt to remain hidden while Terry advanced into position. If Custer opted for the latter, he could maintain the element of surprise and still attack from a position of advantage, blocking the Sioux from escaping to the east. The potential risks were high, but so were the rewards. If his timing and execution were flawless, Custer could have also followed Terry's more cautious advice to march up the Rosebud and begin his descent into the Little Bighorn Valley on the 25th. However, even if he chose to march at night, the soldiers would leave a trail as clear as day, signaling their approach and prompting the village to scatter. This would likely result in Custer losing track of the village, and worse, the Sioux might escape undetected and launch a counter-attack on Terry's advancing forces. Historian John Gray provides a sympathetic view of Custer's predicament, excusing the general's hesitations and indecisiveness. Yet we know that many Sioux and Cheyenne warriors had seen the approaching cavalry and chose not to alert the main village, either due to overconfidence or miscalculation. This was a critical oversight on their part, given the battle's historical significance. Custer, however, was resolute in his determination to find and engage the village, with or without Terry. In hindsight, one might criticize Custer's judgment, but it's clear his mission, based on the campaign's objectives and the proximity of the Sioux, left little room for inaction. With the assumption that the Sioux village was moving, downstream time was becoming a more pressing concern. Custer had to act quickly to prevent the Sioux from either fleeing or confronting Terry. Conflicting reports about the Sioux's exact movements complicated matters further. Had the Crows really seen the Sioux moving downstream, or were they simply guessing based on the freshness of the tracks? While the Sioux were definitely located along the lower Little Bighorn, their exact movements remained ambiguous, creating additional uncertainty for Custer's next move. Back at the Busby camp, after receiving updates from the scouts, Custer gathered his officers and outlined his plan for a night march. He aimed to cross the divide unnoticed and position his forces for a surprise attack. Those who had fought with Custer at the Battle of Washita in 1868 might have recognized the similarities in his strategy. Despite not having fully made up his mind earlier, the fresh intelligence from the Crows solidified his decision. Custer's urgency to beat Terry and Gibbon to the Sioux underscored his confidence and desire for personal glory, even if it meant taking significant risks. At 9:20 p.m., Varham and 15 scouts left camp for the Crow's Nest, a vantage point 11 to 12 miles away. Shortly after their departure, Custer briefed his officers, emphasizing the need for secrecy. He planned to attack on the morning of the 26th, once the village had been located. As the command prepared for the night march, darkness had fully descended, and by 11:48 p.m., the crescent moon had set, leaving the landscape in total darkness. The decisions made at this juncture had profound consequences. While Custer's approach had been bold, it also left little room for flexibility. His confidence in attacking the village, regardless of the risks posed by the larger-than-expected number of Sioux warriors, highlighted both his audacity and the potential pitfalls of overconfidence. This episode underscores one of the key themes of the Custer campaign: time without a precise understanding of when specific events occurred. It becomes challenging to assess the actions and decisions of the individuals involved. Dr. John S. Gray's analysis in Custer's last campaign is perhaps the most thorough attempt to address this issue, though it suffers from certain biases. Gray's work is framed by his own preconceptions, forcing the timeline to fit his personal theories. Nonetheless, the sequence of events on June 24th remains a crucial piece of the puzzle in understanding Custer's ultimate fate. In analyzing the time dynamics during the Battle of Little Bighorn, it's essential to acknowledge the absence of standardized time in 1876, which adds layers of complexity to understanding historical events. Time zones as we know them today weren't implemented until 1883, following the Prime Meridian Conference in Washington, D.C., where the United States adopted Greenwich Mean Time. Before that, towns relied on local timekeeping, often as rudimentary as a store's clock. In the case of the 7th Cavalry LED by Custer, there's a debate over whether they were following local sundown or using a more centralized time standard like St. Paul or Chicago time. Some argue that Custer's regiment likely adhered to headquarters time from St. Paul, which would have been nearly an hour ahead of local time at Little Bighorn, creating discrepancies in timing during the battle. John Gray, a noted historian, staunchly supported the idea that the troops followed local sun time, arguing that the movement westward necessitated continual adjustment of watches. However, this obsession with time adjustments might be overblown. Soldiers in prolonged campaigns were often more attuned to the sun and its position in the sky than their unreliable dust-exposed watches. Furthermore, many soldiers, including the Montana Column LED by John Gibbon, may have been using time standards set at Fort Ellis or even San Francisco, throwing in further time discrepancies across the forces converging on Little Bighorn. Several historians have contested Gray's perspective, noting that some of Custer's men were more likely using St. Paul time 57 minutes ahead of local sun time. Lieutenant George Wallace, for example, is said to have operated on Chicago time, which was around an hour and a half ahead of Montana's sun time. Gregory F. McNaughton and Tom Hesketh are among those who support this, citing evidence that the soldiers maintained headquarters time regardless of local variances. A notable moment occurred on June 24th during the Busby bivouac, when Custer's halt was recorded by Wallace at 7:45 p.m., approximately sunset in Montana. Yet on St. Paul time, it would have been only 6:30 p.m., suggesting Wallace might have been relying more on his experience than his watch. What stands out is the ambivalence toward exact timing among the participants. Despite being a critical military engagement, exact times were rarely recorded with precision. Many accounts, including those of Wallace, were approximations based on field knowledge rather than rigorous timekeeping. As former G Company Private Theodore W. Golden pointed out, neither the soldiers nor the officers had clear recollections of the time between Reno's retreat and earlier maneuvers, underscoring the indifference to time as a strategic element. This lack of precision extended to notable figures like Lieutenant Varnum, who admitted his estimates were based on the opinions of others rather than first-hand knowledge. One factor contributing to this confusion was the poor quality of the timepieces themselves. Watches were susceptible to damage from the harsh conditions of dust and cold, and only a few, such as the interpreter Fred Gerard, carried reliable watches. Gerard's watch had been recently cleaned before leaving Fort Lincoln, making his account more trustworthy, though there's still the question of how often he could check it during the chaos of battle. Adding to this complexity, the only official mention of watch synchronization came during a June 22nd officer's call, when Lieutenant Godfrey reported that watches were compared to establish official time. Godfrey and Wallace later testified at the Reno Court of Inquiry that their watches had not been adjusted for local time, reinforcing the notion that the regiment was likely operating on St. Paul time throughout the battle. This testimony stands in direct contradiction to Gray's insistence on local sundown as the standard. The question of time is particularly critical when examining pivotal moments in the battle, such as Custer's decision to resume the march on June 24th after a 4-hour halt at East Muddy Creek. At that point, White Swan, a Crow scout, returned with news of a fresh camp at the forks of the Rosebud, and Varnum reported the reappearance of a trail initially spotted by Herondine. Wallace confirmed the timing of this march as starting at 5 p.m., providing one of the few definitive times we can rely on looking deeper into the battle. Multiple witnesses, including Indian scouts, soldiers, and interpreters, referred to key events happening around midday. Dr. Henry Rinaldo Porter with the Reno Column placed the first gunfire at approximately 1:30 p.m. on St. Paul time, quite close to what actually happened. Gerard, the interpreter, also claimed that Reno's retreat occurred around 2 p.m., a reasonable approximation. These accounts clash with Gray's assertion that the firing only started well after 2 p.m., even if using local time. Additionally, it's worth mentioning that Native American accounts also centered around solar observations, like the sun being overhead or when midday meals were being prepared. Despite Gray's tendency to downplay Indian perspectives, their references align closely with the events, reinforcing that the timing was closer to midday than Gray suggests. In conclusion, while Gray's analysis provides valuable insights, his rigid attachment to local sundown ignores several important testimonies and creates discrepancies in understanding the battle's timeline. By considering a broader set of evidence, including accounts from military participants and Native American observers, it becomes evident that the regiment likely adhered to headquarters time, rendering Gray's interpretation less tenable. The issue of time, though seemingly minor, holds immense significance in accurately reconstructing the actions and decisions made at Little Bighorn. Ultimately, understanding these critical timings can give us a clearer picture of the strategies and miscalculations that define the infamous battle. The next noted stop of the day was at 7:45 p.m. set by Wallace at the Busby campsite. Yet when we scrutinize the timeline and the events leading up to it, Wallace's recollection raises some questions. For one, the distance from East Muddy Creek to Busby Bend is around 12 miles. This would require a marching speed of nearly 4.5 miles per hour, a pace that's more of a fast walk, but the facts suggest otherwise. Wallace himself mentioned, "We passed through several large camps. The trail was fresh now, and the whole valley scratched up by the trailing lodge poles." Similarly, George Herendine noted that as they resumed their march, the trail grew fresher, and several campsites seemed to be closely spaced, signaling that the Native Americans were moving slowly, likely only shifting for better grass. This gradual pace was mirrored by the regiment, which also moved slowly, halting multiple times. Godfrey's account adds, "The march during the day was tedious. We made frequent, long stops to avoid outpacing the scouts, who were diligently surveying the area, especially toward Tulix Creek. The dry weather left a dusty trail, and we marched on separate paths to minimize the dust clouds. The valley was littered with lodgepole trails and pony tracks, revealing that large herds had crossed." This description hardly supports a pace of 4.5 miles per hour. It raises the question, was Wallace's 7:45 halt based on local time or St. Paul headquarters time? To unravel this, we need to consider various testimonies. Charles Varnum, in letters and interviews from the early 1900s, mentioned the regiment camped around dark. Private Charles Windolf of Benton's Company H provided perhaps the clearest hint, writing, "On the third day, we covered over 30 miles and made camp at sundown. Up here in late June, that means around 9 o'clock. Supporting this, M Company's Daniel Newell recalled Indian gunfire ceasing around 9 p.m. Bentini noted frequent and extended stops. On June 24th, upon reaching Mud Creek, Col Keogh humorously invited Bentini to camp beside him, saying he had saved a prime spot with good grass. Bentini's playful response, "Bully for you." Keogh suggested camaraderie despite the fatigue. Colonel William A. Graham, in his detailed work, The Custer Myth, quoted Bentini similarly. Upon arriving in camp, my old friend Kio called out, saying he had saved the best spot for me. So I moved my troop there. It was twilight by then, Benton recalled. Lieutenant Carlo Derudio, telling one of his long-winded stories, to which Benton interrupted, sensing they wouldn't be staying long and advising his men to rest. Moments later, a trumpeter summoned them to Custer's tent. According to Godfrey, they set up camp near sundown, around 28 miles into their march, and were instructed to prepare to move again by 11:30 p.m. Reno. During his 1879 testimony, noted twilight lingered until after 9 p.m. Wallace himself claimed deep twilight occurred around this time. As well, local sunset was officially at 7:53 p.m. with the sun disappearing behind the mountains around 7 p.m., making it appear darker. These details suggest the regiment was operating on headquarters time, not local sun time, while other soldiers, like Herondine and Edgerly, mentioned earlier stops for p.m. and 5 p.m. respectively. Their accounts might reflect confusion or errors in memory. In contrast, Private Taylor, writing decades later, recalled stopping around 7 p.m. though the passage of time often distorts such recollections. Taylor's inaccuracies aside, the local phenomenon of earlier darkness due to the mountains likely contributed to the confusion over exact times. Using conditions rather than specific times as markers can often be more reliable, as memories of sunset tend to be clearer than the hands on a clock. As Private Golden suggested, none of them had a clear recollection as to time. Therefore, it's wise to trust the descriptive elements over precise timings when inconsistencies arise. If Wallace had set his watch to headquarters time, his 7:45 p.m. halt would correspond to 6:48 p.m. local time, too early for the reports of sunset. But if he used local sundown time, the halt occurred around 8:42 p.m. headquarters time, which aligns better with the recollections of sundown. This gives us a more realistic march speed of about 3.2 miles per hour, a far more plausible pace for a slow, steady advance through dusty trails and large encampments. Considering the numerous halts, stream crossings, and dust clouds, it seems Wallace might have simply gauged the time by the setting sun rather than consulting his watch. Custer, meanwhile, had been riding ahead of the main column with his scouts, who frequently returned with reports. As darkness fell, 3 scouts informed him that the Sioux had turned west, likely heading toward the lower Little Bighorn. They suggested riding to a nearby promontory at dawn to scout the valley. Custer agreed, sending the Crows back out to follow the trail until they could confirm the village's location. He also dispatched Varnum and other scouts to accompany them. Initially, Custer planned to stay put, but soon changed his mind, ordering a night march toward the divide. Varnum was told to leave around 9 p.m., with a command following at 11 p.m. in the end. The timing discrepancies can be reconciled with some logic. Despite a grueling march, the regiment stopped around dusk, likely 7:45 p.m. local time or 8:42 p.m. headquarters time. After briefly resting, Custer met with his scouts and quickly decided to press on. His urgency and swift decisions reflect the military leader's temperament, and any delay would have been out of character. Thus, despite lingering questions, it's clear that the regiment's movements were dictated more by necessity and instinct than by the ticking of a clock. After Varnum set off on his mission, Custer wasted no time and called for an officers' meeting, confirming Benteen's earlier intuition about a night operation. Lieutenant Godfrey later recalled this call happening around 9:30 p.m., which would be about 8:33 local time, long after civil twilight, when it was too dark to see without artificial light. By then, Godfrey and his companion, Luke Hare, had just settled in for a brief rest, heads resting on saddle blankets, but their peace was short-lived. As news of Custer's gathering quickly reached them, it was already pitch dark, which added to their difficulty in finding Custer's tent, a problem that Benteen never managed to resolve as he missed the meeting entirely. The absence of campfires, a usual sign of settling in for the night, also hinted at how short their stay at Busby was expected to be during the meeting. Custer outlined his strategy for the coming hours, a night march set to begin at 11 p.m., barely an hour and a half away. The goal was to find a concealed position the next day, scout the area thoroughly, pinpoint the exact location of the Indian encampment, and then launch a pre-dawn attack on June 26th. It was a concise meeting, no time wasted. Benteen, always anticipating, had already prepped for this moment. Even before the others gathered, he had slipped on his cavalry boots and ordered First Sergeant Joseph McCurry to ensure all the men were ready for a quick departure. Tightened bridles, packed gear, everything in order. As Benteen made his way through the darkness, he crossed paths with Keogh, who confirmed what he had expected all along. No point in going to the meeting. You are right, we're moving out at 11 sharp. Looks like another sleepless night for us. This would be the second consecutive night without sleep for the troops, a taxing ordeal that would wear down man and horse alike. The pace of events seemed relentless, but Custer's urgency hinted at the pivotal moments that lay ahead, with no time for second guesses or delays. What becomes striking here is not just the pace of the decisions, but the eerie calm and routine in how these seasoned officers dealt with their reality lack of sleep. Impending battle and life or death stakes, all boiled down to a matter of fact, exchange in the dark, the familiarity with exhaustion. The resignation to sleepless nights speaks volumes of the hard, relentless life of these cavalry men, something often lost in the more romanticized depictions of such campaigns. The idea that these men would be marching through treacherous, uncertain terrain with little to no rest added layers of complexity to the strategy. Custer's decision for a night march, while daring, was fraught with danger. Moving troops in the dark increases the risk of confusion, disarray, and potential exposure to enemy scouts. Yet it also offered the element of surprise, a crucial advantage against the Sioux. The fine balance between risk and reward showcased Custer's boldness, but also the precariousness of the situation the 7th Cavalry found itself in.